How's it going? In this series of videos, I want to explore the idea of bias, both in photographic judges and in photographers in general. I've included chapter links in the description below in each video, although I do suggest that you watch the videos in the order that they're presented. Welcome back. As photographers, we spend many hours discussing the pros and cons of the different types of cameras, while many magazine articles and videos review the strengths and weaknesses of the various cameras. As photographers, we spend large amounts of time learning about our cameras and how to use them. What settings do we need for different situations? It is an area many novice photographers still struggle with. We also invest large amounts of money and time in buying just the right type of lens for our photography and then learning how to use it. We also often attend short courses and workshops to improve our skills. As photographers, there are many tours that advertise that they will take you to exotic places while teaching you about photography and improving your skills. In fact, one of the strengths of photographic clubs is that they help photographers to develop their skill levels in many ways, such as workshops and group discussions. We also spend many hours trying to understand the nuances and intricacies of composition, with many articles and videos being written on the subject. This is another topic where many photographers still struggle. Camera clubs have photographic judges critique their images with a view to assisting their members to improve their skills. In recent years, discussions and questions around artificial intelligence have increased, and it is a question I'm often asked when visiting camera clubs. It's a question that has not been seriously discussed by our country's magazines or leading organisations, as they have failed to generate symposiums, conferences, or any form of serious discussion on this topic. Instead, leaving it up to individual judges, clubs and competitions to determine AI policy and to also understand how to police the issue. This has resulted in a complete mess, with many different poorly thought out rules governing different competitions, that it becomes almost impossible for judges and photographers to understand the different rules. In fact, the leading state organisations have failed to respond to the Australian Copyright Council's request for input into AI copyright discussions in 2023. All this effort, money and time spent on understanding photography, but this understanding is centered around either the technical or the aesthetic value within an image. Photographic psychology is not something many photographers study or even consider, including those that have studied at university. As photographic judges all come from a photographic background, they likewise do not consider image psychology as an important area of study, and consequently, many judges know very little of this topic. As photographers and judges, we study photography and use words like photography, fine art, sharpness, and impact. I'm sure you've heard all of these terms used in a judge's critique. But what is photography? What is impact? What is sharpness? We need to be able to define these terms so we can understand them. When asked to define photography, many people will use this standard definition. But this is only a definition of a photograph and not of photography. It in fact does not define the difference between, say, an Edward Steichen image and an Ansel Adams, or the difference between a Man Ray and an Annie Leibovitz image. nor does it discuss why some people prefer taking landscapes while others prefer street photography, or some people prefer realistic images while others prefer artistic images. So we as photographers and judges spend many hours and a lot of money on understanding photography, but very little effort in understanding and studying the psychology of images. The study of photographic psychology must also include the study of bias, which is the subject of these videos. As a photographer, what encourages me to pick up the camera and take an image is purely subjective. As a photographer, my editing practice is purely subjective. As a viewer, walking through a gallery, my experience again is purely subjective. But as a photographic judge, if I judge subjectively, I allow my personal likes and dislikes to color the critique of someone else's artwork. In fact, I'm trying to make them clones of myself. As a photographic judge, I need to understand both image psychology and bias. As a photographer, it is an advantage to understand the motivation of people who view your images. In this series of videos, we will cover some of the biases that affect photography and photographic judges. It is by no means an exhaustive list. These videos hopefully will challenge your judging process if you are a practicing judge, and give you a better understanding of the motivation of those who trust you with their precious images. As a photographer, hopefully these videos will give you a better understanding of your audience. Before we begin, I would like to draw your attention to a quote from Barack Obama. This quote will surface several times through this study, as it is an important concept in bias. Increasingly, we become so secure in our bubbles that we accept only information, whether true or not, that fits our opinions instead of basing our opinions on the evidence that's out there. This is certainly a very important concept within this study. So a bias is a tendency, inclination, or prejudice towards or against something or someone. Some biases are positive and helpful, like choosing only to eat healthy foods, or staying away from someone who knowingly causes harm. But biases are often based on stereotypes rather than actual knowledge of an individual or circumstance. Whether positive or negative, such cognitive shortcuts can result in prejudgments that lead to rash decisions or discriminatory practices. The Swedish academic Mats Alvesson says more critical reflection is what's required. He researches functional stupidity, where buzz phrases and supposedly innovative ideas take hold in a firm or bureaucracy, even when almost everyone involved knows that it's all nonsense. A lot of people engage in rather meaningless meetings. They work with policy and value statements that don't really make sense and which nobody takes seriously. Professor Alvesson says functional stupidity helps reduce friction and stress, but it eventually becomes a problem. Professor Kassam from the University of Warwick says there is no time to really develop a point and to explain one's thinking in a considered way. This lack of time can encourage our reliance on biases and lead us to negative aspects and opinions instead of considered logical thought. He says, we need to think more slowly. Biases come in many forms. For instance, racial profiling or gender bias, as shown in this graphic. These are just some of the many different types of biases. Yet some psychologists say there is only one bias, and that is bias, and all the rest are merely triggers. Some psychologists, on the other hand, say there are many types of biases, and by labeling the various types of biases, it will be easier for us mortals to better understand the bias differences. Is this in fact a bias? For these videos, we will be concentrating on cognitive bias, as this affects art the most. To understand the basics, a bias is a disproportionate weight in favour of or against an idea or thing, usually in a way that is closed-minded, prejudicial, or unfair. Biases can be innate or learned. People may develop biases for or against an individual, a group, or a belief. You will also find that many biases tend to blend into each other, and a single behaviour may be labelled under different biases. To start to understand bias, we must first begin to understand how we reason. Aristotle said that our unique capacity to reason is what defines us as human beings. Therefore, our happiness or our flourishing consists in leading a life that enables us to use and develop our reason, and that is in accordance with reason. Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, states that all human beings are endowed with reason. And it has long been held that reason is something that God gave us, that we share with God, and that is the divine, immortal element within us. At the dawn of the so-called Age of Reason, Descartes doubted everything except his ability to reason. Because reason, he wrote, is the only thing that makes us men and distinguishes us from the beasts. I would prefer to believe that it exists in its entirety in each of us. But what exactly is reason? For a start, is more than a mere associative thinking, more than the mere ability to move from one idea such as storm clouds to another such as imminent rain. Associative thinking can result from processes other than reason, such as instinct, learning, or intuition. Reason, in contrast, involves providing reasons, ideally good reasons, for an association, and it involves using a system of representation such as thought or language to derive or arrive at that association. The psychology of reasoning, also known as cognitive science of reasoning, is the study of how people reason, often broadly defined as the process of drawing conclusions to inform how people solve problems and make decisions. It overlaps with psychology, philosophy, linguistics, cognitive science, artificial intelligence, logic, and probability theory. Psychological experiments on how humans and other animals have been carried out for over 100 years. An enduring question is whether or not people have the capacity to be rational. Current research in this area addresses various questions about reasoning, rationality, judgments, intelligence, relationships between emotion and reasoning, and development. There are several alternative theories of the cognitive process that human reasoning is based upon. One view is that people rely on mental logic consisting of formal, abstract, and syntactic inference rules, similar to those developed by logicians in the propositional calculus. Another view is that people rely on domain-specific or content-sensitive views and rules of inference. A third view is that people rely on mental models, that is, mental representations that correspond to imagined possibilities. A fourth view is that people compute probabilities. One controversial theoretical issue is the identification of an appropriate competence model, or a standard against which to compare human reasoning. Initially, classic logic was chosen as a competence model. To be rational is to be able to reason. 30 years ago, psychologists believed that human reasoning depended on formal rules of inference akin to those of logical calculus. This hypothesis ran into difficulties which led to an alternative view. Reasoning depends on envisaging the possibilities, considering consistent with the starting point, a perception of the world, a set of assertions, a memory, or some mixture of them. We construct mental models of each distinct possibility and derive a conclusion from them. The theory predicts systematic errors in our reasoning, and the evidence corroborates this prediction. Yet our ability to use counterexamples to refute invalid inferences provides a foundation for the rationality. This is usually totally unconscious act on the part of humans. The term cognitive bias was first coined in the 1970s by Israeli psychologists, who used this phrase to describe people's flawed patterns of thinking in response to judgment and decision problems. Cognitive bias is where we humans have a tendency to think in a particular way that can lead to systematic deviations from making rational judgments. These tendencies usually arise from A. Mental shortcuts known as heuristics. B. The limited processing ability of our brains. Yes, the limited processing ability of our brains. C. Emotional and moral motivations. D. Distortions in storing and retrieving memories. This is an area that many barristers will attack with a person on the witness stand. And E. Social influence. There are in fact over 163 types of cognitive bias. We will not be studying all of them. The human brain is powerful but subject to limitations. Cognitive biases are often the result of your brain's attempt to simplify information processing and often work as rules of thumb that help you make sense of the world and reach decisions with relative speed. Psychologists believe that many of these biases serve as an adaptive purpose. They allow us to reach decisions quickly, while they can often be surprisingly accurate. They can also lead to errors in thinking. Some cognitive biases are related to problems with attention. Since attention is a limited resource, people have to be selective about what they pay attention to in the world around them. Because of this, subtle biases can creep in and influence the way we see and think about the world. They are also rooted in thought processing errors, often arising from problems with memory, attribution, or other mental mistakes. Signs of cognitive bias may be easier to spot in others, but it is important to know that it is something that also affects our thinking as well. Some signs that we might be influenced by some type of cognitive bias include only paying attention to information or stories that confirm your opinions, blaming outside factors when things don't go your way, attributing other people's success to luck but taking personal credit for your own accomplishments, assuming that everyone else shares your opinions or beliefs, and finally, learning a little about a topic and then assuming you know all there is to know about it. When we're making judgments and decisions about the world around us, we like to think that we are objective, logical, and capable of taking in and evaluating all the information that is available to us. Unfortunately, these biases sometimes trip us up, leading to poor decisions and bad judgments. Cognitive bias may occur if you had to think about every possible option when making a decision. It would take a lot of time to make even the simplest choice. Because of the sheer complexity of judging photographs and the amount of information in the environment, it is necessary sometimes to rely on some mental shortcuts that allow us to act quickly. Cognitive bias may also increase as people get older due to decreased cognitive flexibility. And I'm sorry for older people if you disagree with that one. As a bias is a strong preconceived notion of someone or something based on information we have, perceived to have, or lack. It is a subjective way of thinking that originates from an individual's own perception or points of view. There are different types of bias people experience that influence and affect the way we think, behave, perceive others, and artwork. In this video, I asked two questions. What is photography and what is impact? Both of these cannot be defined in general terms. Only on an individual basis can these be defined, as they are unique to each and every person. Yes, there is some commonality, but when looked at closely, these two terms are highly individual as they rely on our own individual biases. We looked at two research psychologists and what they said about biases and what biases are. Our journey led us to understand what reason is and how we use reason. An understanding of what cognitive bias is and why, as humans, we make use and misuse of cognitive bias. This has created the groundwork for us to build upon in our quest to understand bias and its effect on both photographers and judges. In the next video, we will start to look at some individual cognitive biases and how and why they affect us as photographers and judges. We will also start to see that biases are not discrete entities, but are most often blurred, morphing into one another so that a person may be influenced by more than one bias at a time. I hope this important but rarely referenced area of photography is challenging some of your fundamental concepts. I hope to see you in the next video.